A leak of US Treasury documents has linked Australian banks to billions of dollars in suspected money laundering. The Big Four and several other Australian banks are mentioned in hundreds of times in the documents dubbed the FinCEN Files. Shared by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the documents detail money flows worth over $2.5 trillion, suspected of being the proceeds of crime or corruption. Will Fitzgibbon is one of the lead authors and has been looking into the documents for over a year. Will, welcome. How did you get hold of this information?
These super sensitive documents were obtained by BuzzFeed News in the United States a number of years ago and have been shared with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists precisely so that we at ICOJ could go about bringing together a team of 400 reporters from across the world to dig into all of this.
Okay, so how did you sort through the quantity of information to find these suspicious transactions?
ICOJ is a network of hundreds of journalists with now quite advanced online tools that reporters can use around the world to dig into these files. We're talking about highly confidential material that banks and US regulators certainly never intended or wanted journalists to see. There's a reason why it took us more than a year to produce these reports, is because they are complicated, they are extremely serious, in many cases very serious allegations against some of the world's most powerful politicians, corporations and individuals, and it really did take all this time to make sure that we can report what we have reported today, which is that the financial system is fundamentally broken and far too much dirty money is circulating around the world.
We'll get on to the consequences of what you found in just a moment, but Australian banks are among those linked to these suspicious transactions. What form do they take?
Australia emerged surprisingly significantly in the FinCEN Files. There's actually a document called the Australia Report, which banking regulator AUSTRAC asked the US Department of Treasury to provide to it. And that's a detailed account of scores and scores of companies and individuals within Australia, including banks, that were involved in transactions that financial watchdogs saw and considered to bear the hallmarks of suspicious activity, money laundering, fraud, for example. I think what is important about that is not all of those transactions were criminal or were indeed fraudulent, but quite clearly banks and specialists in this area saw alarm bells ringing, often only after this money had made its way through the system. And by that stage, of course, it's too late.
So would you say that the banks would have been aware that the transactions were questionable or suspicious?
I can't speak to every case, but what the FinCEN Files definitely showed is that a journalist like me sitting here in Washington, DC, or a journalist in Ukraine or Russia could, looking at the exact same transactions, pose legitimate questions and concerns about the kind of transactions that were happening. For example, I think any Australian out there would probably agree that if a company whose owners are not publicly known, maybe a company that's created in a tax haven, is sending millions of dollars around the world, maybe multiple times within 48 hours, that a bank should probably ask a few more questions before it ticks the box and gives the green light for that money to move. But we saw that time and time again.
Are Australian individuals named as well, Will?
There are Australian individuals named within the reports. They include people who sent money and people who received money. Those individuals, as I say, aren't necessarily the victims or the perpetrators of wrongdoing. That's not what these suspicious activities actually reveal. What they do reveal is that there were dozens of Australians, just like dozens of citizens in nearly every country in the world, involved in these transactions that banks and banking regulators thought we need to look at a second time.
And how high up in terms of authority are some of these individuals?
Well, across the world, we're talking about some of the world's most powerful, in some cases terrifying individuals. We're talking about the so-called boss of bosses, an alleged mafia leader in Ukraine. We're talking about a former vice president in Nigeria, a former vice president in the Democratic Republic of Congo, current politicians. We're talking about US President Donald Trump's former campaign manager, Paul Manafort, who also appears in these suspicious transactions. Of course, he was more recently sentenced to jail for a whole bunch of financial crime-related charges. So it does, I think, show that people in these documents, people who we are writing about and exposing, are not just unknown individuals sending money here and there. They're people who you might recognise from the news either now or maybe in a few months or years' time.
OK, so on to the consequences then. What do you expect, what do you want to come from these revelations?
Well, I think we've spent the last year speaking to so many experts about the transactions we see in this document who tell us that the financial system is fundamentally broken, that banks are supposed to be one of the first, stalwarts against financial crime. A bank is meant to be and has the right to stop a transaction if it looks dodgy. What the FinCEN Files shows is that banks often do not do that. That's for a whole number of reasons. First of all, banks make a lot of money from processing transactions, even when those transactions are potentially suspicious. But experts at the same time have told us that some of the reforms would not be terribly difficult. A bank, for example, could simply say no to processing a transaction from a shell company whose owner is not known to the bank. A bank could also much more rapidly report a suspicious transaction, and also information could be shared much more globally so that it doesn't take Australia years or months to learn the same thing that perhaps authorities in the United States have known for a while.
Now, the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists has been involved in a number of data leaks in the past, including the Panama Papers. That was back in 2016. Has there been any reform or change to come from the release of that financial information?
There definitely has been reform and improvement. I know that investigative journalists have a bit of a reputation for painting the world as going to hell in a handbasket. And while the FinCEN Files today clearly shows that there's a whole lot still wrong with the financial system, if we take the Panama Papers example as just one particular case, there have been dozens of laws across dozens of countries introduced since that project to make sure the financial system is cleaner. There have been dozens of people, including in the United States and in Australia, investigated, even criminally charged with tax evasion. And there's been over $1 billion recouped or repaid in fines and penalties. I think they're just some examples that show investigative journalism of this nature can have an impact and does have an impact, even if, of course, what we learned from the FinCEN Files is that dirty money, dodgy money continues to flow around the world at an alarming rate.
Will Fitzgibbon, thank you.
Thank you.